This is The Body's Compass with Matt Sorensen. This is the third and final episode of this mini-series, and today Matt gets practical with a new framework model that he has identified over the last 20 plus years. This model, explained over the last two episodes, were conceptually heavy by design, covering the neuroscience of how emotional experience becomes physically embedded in tissue, the baroreceptor mechanism, and why patterns persist long after the original cause is gone. If some of that landed, that's the mechanism working. Today is about what you can actually do about it. The interventions, the sequence, where to start, what reaches which level of the visceral autonomic emotional integration loop, or VAEI, and why doing one thing without the other only gets you so far. Let's get into it.
Welcome back to The Body's Compass. I'm Matt Sorensen. Today, this is the third and final kind of episode of this little mini-series, and I want to start by just quickly acknowledging something. Last two episodes have been a little heavy, not emotionally heavy necessarily, but for some of you it might have seemed, well, they may have been conceptually heavy. So we've covered a lot of ground. The neuroscience of how emotion becomes physical, the baroreceptor mechanism, the brainstem recalibration loop. The reason these patterns persist long after the original cause has gone. So if you've stayed with it, thank you. I know it's been a lot. And I know that the most common response to that kind of information is a particular kind of frustration, the frustration of understanding something more clearly than you did before and still not really knowing what to do about it. So hopefully that ends today. This episode is more practical, and I'm going to tell you exactly what kinds of intervention reach the mechanism that I've been describing in the last two episodes, what each one does, at what level of the loop it operates, where it's powerful, where it runs out, and where it needs to be combined with to produce, a lasting change. And also going to be honest, more honest than most, about the limitations of every approach, including my own, because I think the most useful thing I can give you isn't a pitch for a particular modality or one philosophy. It's a map, an honest map, a way of understanding what different kinds of healing work actually do at the level of the specific mechanism we've been exploring. So for you, you can make better decisions about your own health and the health of the people that you care about. So let's get into it. So just to revisit, and before we talk about intervention, I want to briefly revisit the loop that I've been building across these three episodes, because understanding where you can enter the loop determines what you can actually reach. So here's the loop in its simplest form. An emotional experience, a loss, a threat, sustained period of stress, produces a sympathetic activation. That activation alters the vascular tone, innervating the organ, feeding the vasculature. Over time, that altered vascular tone produces fascial restriction in the connective tissue envelope surrounding the organ. The restricted organ generates abnormal afferent drives, specifically altered baroreceptor signals to the brainstem. The brainstem recalibrates to a chronic stress set point. The recalibrated brainstem maintains a sympathetic dominance, which maintains the vascular tension, which maintains the restriction, which maintains the abnormal signal. Round and round and round it goes. The loop has multiple entry points, and this is the key clinical insight. You don't have to start at the beginning of the loop just to interrupt the loop. You can really enter anywhere. What determines which intervention you use is which entry point is most accessible given your situation. your resources, and essentially who you're working with. So I'm going to give you 4 levels of intervention. Each one of these maps to a specific entry point in the loop. Each one has genuine power, and each one has a ceiling, a level beyond which I simply cannot reach without something else alongside it. I want you to hold all 4 as complementary, not competing. The most powerful clinical outcomes I've seen in 20 plus years come not from choosing the right intervention, but the combining of interventions across multiple levels simultaneously. So this is tier 1. This is the visceral substrate. This is the deepest level of intervention, and the one that directly addresses the primary maintaining mechanism, which is what I call tier 1, which is direct intervention on the visceral vascular substrate. This is essentially where the restriction lives, in the fascial envelope of the organ, in the vascular tone of the arterioles feeding the organ, in the reduced mobility and motility of the organ within its fascial connections to the surrounding structures. So essentially, the most direct tier 1 intervention is manual therapy, such as visceral vascular neural manipulation, craniosacral therapy, oftentimes chiropractic, and even zone exercises. Visceral manipulation, as an example, uses skilled, gentle manual contact to assess the mobility and motility of the visceral organs. The craniosacral rhythms, the blood pulse pressure, and I'm not talking about the blood pressure per se. The blood pulse pressure is the amount of pressure the blood is going through the arterial system. Remember, we've got arteries, we've got smaller arteries, and we also have capillaries. The capillaries are the end branches of the arterial vascular tree, which innervate the tissues of the periphery. And we need to release these restrictions in their fascial architecture. And a trained practitioner can feel through the quality of tissue response under their hands which organs and which tissues are restricted, in what direction, and how acutely they are restricted. And through sustained, precise manual contact, they can encourage the release of that particular restriction. After all, the body holds the biggest restriction. When this releases, when the liver or kidney or the small intestine, for example, regains its normal range of motion and its normal fascial connection to the surrounding structures, several things happen. The mechanical load on the adjacent musculoskeletal structure changes. The shoulder that was being pulled by restriction of the liver or the colon gets some of that tension released. The hip that was being loaded by a restricted kidney due to venous congestion and a compensating subas, as an example, gets a different mechanical environment. The afferent signal from the organ to the brainstem changes. The abnormal baroreceptor input that was maintaining the chronic stress set point begins to normalize. The brainstem receives a different signal. The autonomic calibration begins then to shift. And sometimes, not always, but often enough, an emotional release recurs, not because the practitioner did anything necessarily psychological, but because the physical substrate maintaining the emotional pattern has been directly addressed. The body receiving different input begins to reconfigure, and the emotional pattern that was being held in the tissue now begins to move. This is not necessarily woo-woo. This is mechanism. The body stores the pattern physically, change the physical, change the pattern. Now, I need to be clear about something. These therapies do require trained hands. However, it is something that you can do yourself. But if you want to explore this modality, I'd strongly encourage you to find a practitioner trained in these modalities, and they're all over the place. Look up Burrell Institute, look up Ledger Institute, even Czech Institute, or Google them who are close to you, and you'll certainly find someone skilled in that. Now, the second tier, one intervention and the most accessible one available without a clinical practitioner, is essentially diaphragmatic breath work. The diaphragm is the most mechanically significant structure in the body, in the visceral mobility that sits on top of the liver and the stomach, fascially continues through the kidneys into the posterior attachments, all the way down from T12 to L2. So technically, you could argue that the diaphragm muscle is also a lower back muscle. It moves, or it should move, with every breath, creating a rhythmic pumping action that drives the mobility of the visceral organs beneath and around it. When the diaphragm is restricted, it's tethered by liver, braced by chronic sympathetic activation, limited by shallow upper chest breathing is the most common one. The organs lose a significant part of their natural mobility and motility stimulus. They sit in a reduced movement environment. The fascial restrictions then deepen. They get lost in this serous fluid membrane. When you store the full diaphragmatic breathing, slow, complete, you restore primary mobility driver of the entire visceral body. You direct influence the organ and the fascial mobility, and you do something else that is mechanicalistically significant. Slow diaphragmatic breathing, particularly at what's called resonance frequency, which is approximately 6 breaths per minute, produces direct baroreceptor activation through rhythmic changes in the intrathoracic and intra-abdominal pressure. Each slow breath creates pressure wave through the body that stimulates baroreceptors. And baroreceptor stimulation, as we established last episode, directly modulates autonomic tone. This is why slow breathing works, not just because it's calming and it feels nice, because it directly stimulates the baroreceptors which signal the brainstem, which shifts the autonomic calibration toward more of a sympathetic dominance. Practically, if you want to begin working with this right now, the simplest starting point is 4 seconds in through the nose, 6 seconds out through the nose. Not into the chest, it's got to be into the belly, the lower rib cage. 10 minutes a day, consistently. Now, that's obviously not a complete intervention, but it's a real one. It's a direct entry point into the loop, accessible to anyone at any time and at zero cost. Now, we're talking about movement that load the viscera. So the third tier approach is specific movement, not general exercise, but movement patterns that directly mobilize the visceral structures through mechanical loading. So, for example, hip flexor lengthening, stretching mobilizes the psoas kidney ureter fascial complex directly. Thoracic rotation decompresses and releases liver and stomach mechanics. Spinal extension loads and mobilizes the posterior visceral structures. These movements don't just stretch the muscles, they move the organs and elongate the arterial system. This is something we explore more in depth with the Czech training. The understanding that the corrective exercise isn't just about muscles and joints, but about the fascial continuity between the movement, the visceral, vascular, neuromeningeal structures. A lunge that properly lengthens the hip flex is also mobilizing the kidney, as an example. A thoracic rotation that frees up the mid-back is also releasing the liver, the stomachs, the lungs, spleen, and pancreas. So when movement is approached with this understanding, when the practitioner or the individual knows that what they're actually doing and why, it becomes significantly more powerful tool than it appears on the surface. As Jean-Pierre Barral says, you do more than you know. So tier 2, this is the autonomic layer. The second level of this intervention operates at the autonomic regulation layer. At the baroreceptor and brainstem level directly. These approaches don't necessarily change the visceral restriction itself, but they directly influence the autonomic set point that the restriction is maintaining. They interrupt the loop at the brainstem level rather than at the tissue level. So one example could be cold water immersion. Cold water, cold showers, swimming, ice baths, etc. They produce one of the most powerful baroreceptor stimulation events available outside a clinical setting. When you enter cold water, peripheral vasoconstriction occurs immediately and often dramatically. Blood is driven centrally. Intra-abdominal pressure increases. The baroreceptors in the major vessels and visceral walls are massively stimulated. And the brainstem response, the autonomic recalibration that follows, produces a measurable shift towards a parasympathetic dominance that can persist for hours after the cold exposure ends. So this is why cold water swimming and ice baths, etc., have such a profound effect on mood, emotional regulation for so many people. It's not just the endorphin response, which is real but quite short-lived. It's the baroreceptor activation and the autonomic recalibration that follows. Now, I need to be honest with this. Cold exposure is not for the faint-hearted, nor is it comfortable. It requires a building tolerance gradually, and it's not appropriate for everyone. There are cardiovascular considerations, particularly anyone with any known heart conditions. But for the majority of people who can tolerate it safely, it is one of the most direct tier 2 interventions available. Now we get on to heart rate variability. Biofeedback is a technology, but it's an assisted approach to learning direct voluntary regulation of the baroreceptor autonomic axis. Heart rate variability is a measure of the variation in time between successive heartbeats. So a high heart rate variability generally reflects a good autonomic regulation and parasympathetic tone. Low heart rate variability reflects chronic sympathetic dominance and reduced autonomic flexibility. So heart rate variability biofeedback trains you to consciously produce what's called heart rate variability coherence, a characteristic rhythmic oscillation in the heart rate that reflects optimal baroreceptor autonomic coupling. So by seeing this in real time on a screen, for example, and learning to breathe and regulate in ways to produce coherence, you develop direct voluntary influence over the baroreceptor brainstem axis. The research on heart rate variability biofeedback is solid and it's growing. Meaningful reductions in anxiety, pain, sensitivity, and emotional reactivity, improved sleep, better cognitive performance under stress, all consistent with the mechanism, a nervous system recalibrating towards a healthier autonomic set point through direct baroreceptor training. So I know there's apps like HRV4 training and devices like the Polar H10 strap or simply a pulse oximeter make this accessible and very affordable. It's not replacement for tier 1 work. The internal restriction is still there, but it's a powerful tier 2 support that most people can begin as early as tomorrow, even today if you're onto it. Neural manipulation. For practitioners working in the neural fields, neural manipulation is a tier 2 approach that addresses the autonomic nervous system directly through manual contact with the central and peripheral nerves, the autonomic ganglia, and the sympathetic chain. By releasing restriction in the neural structures that supply the visceral vasculature, cholic ganglion, the superior mesenteric ganglion, the sympathetic chain. Neural manipulation directly modulates the efferent sympathetic drive, maintaining elevated vascular tone. It interrupts the loop from the efferent side rather than from the afferent. Efferent is the outside. Efferent is the outside. Afferent, with an A, is the inward. In complex situations, combining visceral, neural, and vascular in the same treatment creates more of a complete intervention on the loop rather than just one single approach alone. Now into tier 3. This is the cortical layer. The third level of intervention operates at the cortical interpretation layer, at the level of how the brain constructs meaning from these signals it receives from the body. So I want to be careful how I frame this, because this is the layer that most conventional psychological and somatic therapy operates at. And I don't want to sound or say anything like it's dismissing of that of any kind. It is not. It is genuinely very valuable. It's just that it operates at a specific level of this loop. And understanding that helps clarify both its power, but also its limitations. So we have somatic psychotherapy, somatic experience sensory motor psychotherapy, EMDR, and to some extent mindfulness based therapies all work at the interface between the cortical interpretation and the autonomic regulation. What they do extraordinarily well is change how the brain constructs meaning from the visceral and body signals. They help the nervous system complete responses that essentially got interrupted. They process the narrative and emotional charge attached to a specific experience. They train the cortex to hold difficult internal states without being overwhelmed by them. They also reduce the ongoing emotional activation that feeds back into the loop at the top, the chronic stress that keeps the sympathetic system activated, the visceral vascular neural tension elevated. So this is real, and it's very important. I refer to somatic therapists regularly. I consider them essential partners, if you will, in a complex presentation. But here's the limitation. Psychotherapy operates at the cortical interpretation layer. It changes what the brainstem does with the afferent signals, but it doesn't change the signal itself, which means in presentations where there's an internal restriction, where it's the primary maintaining mechanism, even the most skillful somatic psychological work will likely have a ceiling. The cortex becomes more flexible, more regulated, the more capable of holding difficulty, but the brainstem is still receiving the same abnormal baroreceptor input from the same restricted tissue. That input keeps providing the raw material from which the nervous system constructs its experience from the world and its reality. This is why people can spend years in excellent therapy developing real insight, real emotional flexibility, real understanding, but they still feel a residual something that won't quite shift. A background anxiety that can manage it, but they can't eliminate. A physical bracing that relaxes in good moments, but then returns to under pressure when they perceive they're under pressure. Not because any therapy failed, because the therapy itself was operating at the right level, but not the only level that it needed to be addressed at. We can talk about interceptive meditation. So body scan meditation, yoga nidra, mindful attention to internal sensations. These practices develop the capacity of the anterior insula to accurately read and flexibly respond to visceral, vascular, neuromeningeal symptoms, rather than automatically constructing distress from abnormal afferent input, which is what the recalibrated brainstem does just simply by default, a developed interoceptive system can perceive the signal without amplifying it into a full emotional cascade. It can notice the tension in the right side of the abdomen without immediately constructing anxiety from it. It can feel the restricted breathing pattern without immediately constructing a threat from it. This isn't suppression. It's not bypassing it. It's developing the cortical capacity to receive the body's signal with more accuracy and more flexibility, to see it clearly rather than being flooded by the story of the nervous system, what the nervous system would automatically make of it. So combined with tier 1 work, which is changing the signal itself, interoceptive meditation becomes significantly more powerful. The signal normalizes. The cortical interpretation of the normalized signal becomes more flexible. The loop is interrupted from 2 directions simultaneously. Now I want to talk about yoga specifically because it's one of the few modalities that genuinely operates at a multiple tier level all at once. Specific yoga postures produce direct mechanical pressure and release on visceral vascular tension. This is tier 1. Twist, compress, and release the liver, kidney, for example. Forward folds and extensions load and deload the posterior visceral vascular structures. Inversions alter intra-abdominal pressure and stimulate baroreceptor activation. This is tier 2. When yoga is practiced with interoceptive attention, when the practitioner is genuinely tracking internal sensation rather than achieving a certain position or shape, it develops the cortical flexibility of tier 3 simultaneously. Yoga practices as a performance, getting to the right position, achieving a certain aesthetic, it doesn't reach these levels. Yoga practice as a listening practice does. And the distinction matters enormously. Getting into tier 4, this is foundational. So the 4th level isn't really an intervention per se, it's the biological context within which all other interventions operate. And without it, gains from the other tiers are very, very difficult to sustain. So this is where we can talk about kind of life coaching in a way, or Paul Chek's foundation principles. But just to give you a 101, I talk about sleep as an example. The brain's waste clearance system, called the glymphatic system, operates primarily during deep sleep. The cerebrospinal fluid flows through the brain's interstitial spaces, clearing the neuroinflammatory byproducts that accumulate with chronic sympathetic dominance. Insufficient sleep means insufficient clearance. The neuroinflammatory load builds. The brainstem's capacity to recalibrate toward a parasympathetic dominance is now impaired. Every other intervention becomes less and less and less effective. So sleep's not optimal. The biological foundation on which everything else rests. If sleep is significantly disrupted, I would address that before anything else, because without it, the body simply can't consolidate the other changes that the other interventions are trying to create. So the nutrition, the viscera, and the internal environment, whenever this organ is restricted and maintained part of this inflammatory process in organ tissue, commonly liver, gut, kidney, these presentations, anti-inflammatory nutritional protocols, they directly induce tissue tension that maintains the fascial restriction and keep the loop going at all times. This is slow work. You can't eat your way out of a visceral restriction within a week, but you can't also fully resolve a visceral or internal restriction when the inflammatory environment of the visceral system, vascular system, keeps recreating the tension that the manual therapy released in the last session. So we can talk about omega-3 fatty acids, polyphenol-rich foods, gut microbiome support, reducing the load of reactive foods for most people. That means gluten, dairy, alcohol, refined sugar at minimum. Not necessarily as a religion, but just as a foundation to start. Now we can talk relationships and meaning. So I want to close this tier with something that might seem less clinical than everything else I've covered, but which I believe is, physiological significant as anything else in the previous sort of 3 tiers. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory identifies the social engagement system, the ventral vagal complex, as the highest tier of autonomic regulation. The nervous system achieves its deepest states of safety, not through breath work or cold exposure or even manual therapy, but through the experience of genuine co-regulation with another human being. Being seen, being heard, and being met in a way that the nervous system recognizes as safe. Chronic isolation, relational conflict, and the absence of safe connection maintain sympathetic dominance independently of everything else. No amount of visceral, vascular, neural manipulation will fully compensate for a nervous system that has no experience of rational safety. And meaning, Barrett's constructed emotion theory identifies meaning making as a primary modulator of how the brain interprets these visceral signals. A body experiencing chronic stress in a context of genuine purpose and direction constructs a completely different emotional experience from the same visceral input than a body experiencing the equivalent stress in a context of meaninglessness. This is not soft, this is physiology. Meaning literally changes what the body does with its signals. Before we go into the next tier, it's really important to acknowledge and potentially own the fact that all this is perception. Perception shapes our reality, but we perceive things how we are, not how it really is. So we're talking about the honest Matt. I want to give you the honest version of what I've just described. There is no single intervention reaches the whole loop. Not mine, not anyone's. Manual therapy is often the most direct tier 1 intervention available, but it requires a trained practitioner, and it doesn't address the cortical interpretation layer of the lifestyle foundation. Without tier 3 and 4, supporting the changes are real, but they may not consolidate. Things like psychotherapy and coaching is extraordinary work at the cortical layer, but it can't reach the visceral vascular substrate. Without tier 1 support, the insights are real, but they may not reach the level where their pattern is being generated. Breath work, cold exposure, ice baths, they're powerful tier 2 interventions, accessible by anyone, but they modulate the set point without directly addressing the restriction, maintaining it. Sleep and nutrition and relationships are meaning without the foundation, without none of the rest sustains. So the most effective approach combines interventions across multiple tiers simultaneously, not because one isn't enough, but because the loop is operating at multiple levels, and lasting change requires access to the entire loop. So what that looks like in practice is completely different for different people. For one person, it might be visceral manipulation plus some somatic therapy plus some heart rate variability feedback plus some sleep optimization. For another, it might be just breath work, yoga, maybe some nutrition support, and plus rebuilding a sense of purpose and connection. So there's no one single protocol. There's a principle. Address the loop as it many layers. You can access an honest assessment of where you are currently and what you most need at any given really moment. So these 3 episodes have been building towards a single idea, and that is that your body is not a passive recipient of your emotional life. It is the substrate of it, the place where emotional experience is generated, stored, and maintained. It's not just in the mind, it's not just in the tissue, but it's in all. It's in the vasculature, it's in the fascial architecture, it's in the nervous system of the organs. It's in the baroreceptor signal traveling to the brainstem 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, this is not a reason to despair, obviously. It's a reason to be curious, because if the pattern is in the body, physically, structurally, measurably, then it is also addressable directly at the level where it lives. Not just talked about, not just understood, but addressed. So I've been doing this 20 work for over 20 years now, and the cases that stay with me are the ones where something genuinely shifted for them after years of nothing shifting at all. And they're almost always the cases where we finally found the right level, where the internal restriction that had never been touched before was released, where the nervous system that had been calibrated to threat for a decade or more finally found something different to calibrate to. And this isn't, miracles. They're mechanical. They follow the logic of the mechanism we've been exploring across these last few episodes. So you change the signal, you change the experience. So if this series has opened something for you, a question, a curiosity, a recognition of something in your own body, I'd love to hear about it. You can find me on Instagram at The Body's Compass, or reach out directly through healhub.net. There is also a brand new questionnaire that I've designed for anyone interested to fill out completely free, of course. Just go to healhub.net and find the VAEI assessment. If that resonates, fill it out today, screenshot your results, try the suggestions for 2 to 4 weeks, and then redo the questionnaire and share what happened for you. If you are a practitioner who wants to go deeper into this framework, how to apply it clinically, how to address these levels, how to sequence intervention across the tiers, how to perform let's call it manual therapy protocol for immune dysfunctions, for gut inflammation, for back pain, and multitude of other things. Well, I'll be sharing more about that very soon. The framework we've been exploring across these episodes has a name. The name is the Viscero Autonomic Emotional Integration Model. Now, I haven't found a cooler name for that just yet. I'm open to suggestions, but that's exactly what it is. Visceral Autonomic Emotional Integration Model. And it's the foundation of everything I teach in my mentorship and practitioner training work. So watch this space. For those who signed up to the Inner Circle, I look forward to chatting with you all there, where I can show you how this works more or less in real time. So thanks for hanging in there with me. Exciting things to come. Lots of work has gone into this framework. It is yet to be, let's call it, double-blind study, scientifically valid. It is a pattern I recognized over the last 20 odd years. And the main let's say, inspirations behind looking into this and where, how, why, what, where we hold emotions was first set up probably when I was 3.5, when I lost my mum, and some of the family were able to digest that and some stay in victim. And also, if you look at the Czech totem pole, you'll see the psyche up the top, and the emotion totem is kind of in the middle with the viscera. Paul has said it's a floating symbol. So there are times where an emotional reaction can override the psyche, and someone taking their life as an example of that. That is someone's emotional reaction overbearing their psychological state and their basic need for survival. So this is my attempt to understand that at the physiological level. So there's lots to explore, lots to work on. So if you're interested, reach out. If not, then we can keep it our little secret. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
That's a wrap for this episode of The Body's Compass with Matt Sorensen and the mini-series on the Visceral Autonomic Emotional Integration Framework. 3 episodes, 1 complete picture. If you've made it this far, you now understand something that most practitioners and most clients never get told: why the pattern keeps coming back. What's maintaining it at a level that exercise, bodywork and willpower can't reach, and what it actually takes to shift it. That's not a small thing to understand about yourself. If you want to go deeper into the framework itself, the neuroscience, the mechanism, the clinical map, the VAEI teachings are available at healhub.net. That's where the full framework lives, including the body assessment we've referenced across this series. If you're a practitioner, a therapist, a trainer, a manual therapist, anyone working with people whose patterns aren't shifting, the Sorensen Method Level 1 certification is coming. Built around exactly what we've covered in these 3 episodes. Details at healhub.net. And if you want to work through this with Matt directly, bring your own pattern, your own case, your own questions, the Inner Circle is a live group call with Matt every fortnight. Real answers, not generic advice. The link is at healhub.net/the Inner Circle. Follow us on Instagram at The Body's Compass, subscribe on YouTube at Matt Sorensen Live, and if this mini-series added something, leave us a review. It helps more people find it. As always, thanks for listening. Catch you next time.